Oh, we're live.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll go live in 5, 4. So we are live now. This is Journeys in Podcasting. It's a breakfast edition here in Bogota. And I believe you're in London. I didn't even ask.
That's right, yeah, calling from London, England.
And we're with Keiichi Matsuda. I hope I said that correctly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Creator of hyperreality.
My name is Diego, and this is Keiichi. Thank you very much for joining us today. Would you mind giving us a little bit, talking to us a little bit about your background, of where you came from, and what you?
Sure, yeah, not a problem. So I'm a designer and filmmaker, and I live in London. I have a small design studio here, and we work on things like installations and kind of interactive design bits and film projects, and we have a kind of a mix of commercial and self-initiated work. But my background is in architecture, and I graduated from my master's in 2010. So we've been doing the studio since then, like maybe around 6 years. And yeah, I think when I was studying architecture, I was very interested about how we could use emerging technologies to create new types of spaces. And I guess that's kind of led me to where I am today, working across industries, you know, kind of between architecture, but also between technology and media and film.
Cool. I was looking at a talk, which apparently is not supposed to be online, or you didn't know it was online, called The Future Ways of Living. And the protagonist, you know, we're told, you say that you haven't just brought a new device, but you brought a lifestyle and access to a whole new world of rich environment. And then you explain that there were payout options on the ads. The digital divide, especially in education, is an enormous problem. And it's not about actual access to the technology, but it's about an awareness or a literacy of what to do with the tools. I think I understand that when you design these hyperreality clips, your purpose is to awaken people to the possible dystopias and realities they can create. Most of your clips tend toward the dystopic visions of the future. As you're playing the part of this designer of the future that might come, where do you see it going, more towards a participatory democracy or towards masses being manipulated through these really powerful sensory mediums?
Yeah, I mean, I think that both outcomes are definitely possible, and we'll probably end up with something that it's not one or the other, but it's somewhere between the two, or combines elements of both. You know, you talk about kind of utopia and dystopia, and I'm kind of a big fan of lots of utopian schemes in terms of the architectural world, but I'm not a believer in general of utopia as a concept, which is not necessarily, it's not to say that I think dystopia is the only way. I just think that utopia implies some kind of like equilibrium, like it implies that we reach this perfect and final state. Whereas, you know, as we know, the world is in continual development. So I think, you know, the best thing that we can really aim for is to be advancing, but also making sure that we're looking out for each other, that we're trying to mitigate hardship and reduce suffering. So I think, you know, that's the kind of optimum kind of area we should be heading for. In terms of my films, I think I'm not really trying to predict the future. I'm not trying to say this is where we should go, obviously. It's more about trying to make people understand a lot of the issues like the digital divide that we talk about a lot in certain circles, but a lot of people don't really have access to at all. So I see the films as kind of tools for conversation, you know, getting people talking about these issues.
Mm.
Yeah, your films are like filled with augmented reality, and they show people what this, actually we have that in the physical space. I saw one of your videos, somebody's walking through the street and there's a bunch of ads that you could pick or not, really, regard, you know, depending on what you like or what you don't like, what your interests might be. And we see that in the physical space. It's like Bogota is a city filled with posters and streets and stuff, concert announcements, all sorts of things. And you're just trying to show what that overload, that whole media that we're, you know, constantly being bombarded with might look like in the digital space kind of thing. In that talk that Chris was mentioning before, which was in Italy, it was called the Media Guru in 2005. So last year, 2 years ago, you said that you're trying to get people to think about the fact that we're not tied or bound to the dimensions of the physical spaces anymore. But when you said with the flick of your hand, you're in the virtual space right now, and that opens up a whole bunch of new possibilities.
Sure.
And then your dialogue between that and architecture. What have you seen from the architect's point of view? Like, are they reluctant to, you know, taking on these kind of possibilities or designing spaces that are open to different type of uses?
Yeah, I think, well, my experience of architecture has been one that is quite reluctant to acknowledge the way that we use spaces now. When you go into, you know, like a coffee shop or, you know, something like that now, you take your phone with you take your laptop with you, and you can use that space for whatever you want. But a lot of the architectural design process still stems from first identifying the intended function of the space and then designing the form around it. So it doesn't really work like that anymore, because the function is something that you carry with you in your pocket. So like architects should be now making more flexible spaces which are able to occupy, which are able to kind of a wide range of different types of occupation. But I think often you know, when you're designing a building, you're looking for reasons to make choice. A lot of those reasons at the moment come from you know, the intended functionality. But in terms of the other way, in terms of looking at how architects could help design virtual spaces and augmented spaces, in some areas they are. I can't remember his name now, but I went to an amazing talk by the architectural designer who designed all the buildings from the Halo games.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, you know, he trained as an architect and he built these incredible structures in the virtual world. And of course, nobody's physically visited these structures, but like millions, I don't know, many people have visited them virtually, and, you know, they're very familiar with the layouts and they know all about them, you know. So I think often, even the Halo games, though, they're kind of simulating a type of physical reality. But if we go into a world where we embrace the kind of virtual nature of augmented and virtual space, then we can start to create incredible spaces which are not tied to the laws of gravity or the economic and political situations, and we can create entirely new, different types of spaces. And I think architects are perfectly equipped to be able to think about that and really push. They're not very much involved in the process at the moment.
I feel like you're talking about something that we just talked about with Dan O'Sullivan, who runs the ITP school and the Tisch school in NYU. And he talked about this idea of reprogrammable architecture, where you design spaces that could then be redesigned or recreated for whatever the need is. You know, so the classroom could actually be a completely constructivist environment where it changed settings completely. Sure. This is fascinates us, is this idea of designing classrooms that could then be repurposed for whatever kind of digital content you have, virtual reality, augmented reality, but also the physical parts of, you know, students need to see each other's work. What kind of tools would we put in the space for that? You know, kind of this like Starbucks idea of the classroom where you can walk in and you can experience that environment in, you know, 5 different ways of seating, just looking at the way you sit, but then looking at wall space and look at the way you would interact with those. Yeah. I want to shift to kind of a gamification theme, because you had a segment called Level Up. I'm not sure if you remember which one that is, but it's talking about this idea of like the point collecting. And in game theory, there's, or depending on who you talk to, but there's kind of 3 different types of gamer. There's the point collector, there's the competitor, and then there's the socializer. As you're thinking about these kind of like gamified virtual environments, I guess what I kind of want to get at is, what are you looking at? What are you seeing around you that's kind of being a catalyst for these kind of environments? Are you a gamer? Are you a sci-fi watcher? Like what do you look at that makes you kind of think of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a gamer kind of sometimes. Me and my wife play video games sometimes. And I read a lot of science fiction, more than I watch. But I think, you know, the motivation for putting those kind of gaming elements into the film are not based on the kind of AAA PS4 titles. They're more about the kind of casual mobile gaming birds of this world. And I find like more and more those games are not based on the same, they're not engaging with the same mechanisms that, you know, you get with a really good indie game. They're more based around the mechanics of addiction and those kind of sort of validation mechanisms that keep us coming back and keep us trying harder. So I wouldn't necessarily say that here we're dealing with like gamification in a universal sense. It's just some of the types of techniques that are being used that come from gaming or that have been exploited before in gaming, but now people are finding ways to introduce into, you know, other processes as well. So I think, you know, in the way it's presented in the film is that you have these kind of mediative techniques as a form of societal control. If you're talking about that within the classroom, that's quite a different issue, because of course, classroom is kind of a, you know, dictatorship sort of fascist state. Not in a bad way.
Well, no,
it might be the bad
yeah,
way
I would say,
too.
and the gamification element in schools is a problem as well. In that, the, you know, some of the fastest ways that it moves into classroom or library space is these kind of like points for extrinsic motivators, and to me, it's always based around this idea of, you know, very structured accountability. You know, how much data can we collect from students reading, as opposed to just, you know, a more natural way of just talking to kids about what they're reading, or having them, you know, create presentations or create media around what they're reading. It's always kind of based on these really, in my opinion, really extrinsic motivators that really mess up the intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, and it's kind of counterintuitive to what you're trying to achieve in education, which I suppose is to kind of cultivate a love of learning, a love of, you know, these kind of things. And if you're doing it for other reasons, then you're kind of going against yourself. But
yeah, this also got me thinking about the idea, you mentioned this digital media has this democratizing effect on people, where, you know, like you said before, we always have a phone in our pockets and we can create content now, like produce our own content, and even, you know, have access to massive distribution. You also said, I mean, that gets you thinking about the architecture point of view. Like, architects and politicians are the ones who think and design a space to a specific purpose. But then if you take that into the classroom, then, you know, before the teacher was the center of knowledge and was the one determining what the space was going to be used like and what content was going to be taught to. But if you kind of turn it around, if we thought of like the stuff that you've been doing in the classroom setting, would it be possible that the kids are now the ones, you know, thinking about their own space, how to organize it, and what possibilities that allows for? What have you seen, like, from your movies or the different settings that you have been working on? Have you seen any, like, creative takes on the use of spaces by using this digital media?
Are you talking in like real life examples or kind of examples?
From your perspective, what you've seen with your work.
Yeah, so that's okay. There's a few different elements to that, so I might not be able to. You might need to remind me of some of the earlier points you were making. In terms of like interesting work that's been done with kind of mixed reality spaces, there's a kind of company I'm sure you've come across called The Void, who are making these kind of VR theme park type, more experience type things, where, you know, you go into this building and you have your headset on, and the building is set up so it has the walls in the right places to match up with the real walls so the virtual walls in the space will match up with the real walls, so you'll be able to go and touch things. You know, you can go there with a gun and, you know, shoot things or whatever, and you can also kind of load in several different environments. So maybe you're in like, you know, Tron world in the first one, and then you're in Lord of the Rings world in the next. So like, I think there's this interesting new field of making kind of mixed reality, which supports kind of these specific virtual functions. You could imagine the same kind of thing happening in a classroom, where you have a kind of stock layout which can interface with sort of software, or, you know, kind of whoever's publishing the textbooks, or, you know, making the kind of media content for the course, or for the curriculum, would be able to kind of sell in a system of like virtual classrooms, virtual experiences, which run from, you know, a set platform. In terms of kids actually like designing their own spaces, things like that, I mean, sure, as part of a you know, a course that's talking about that. But I suppose a lot of the valuable thing in education from, you know, from the first, you know, early years education right through to, you know, your kind of postgraduate degrees, it's all about having a structure and a space for which those ideas can come out. So I think, you know, structure is probably the most important education thing, but that's, you know, I'm an outsider in this, so I'd be interested to hear what you think as well.
Well, I mean, we look at all kinds of stuff, and a lot of the things that we get inspired by are ideas from the outside, that the education world can become its own kind of echo chamber, and a very commercially driven sometimes, where, you know, a program comes in and then everyone has to kind of follow the structure of that program.
Right.
But I also think we're kind of in a time right now, whereas I'm going back to the recent interview we just had, where education was described as being sexy, like all of a sudden it's a hot topic in the university world, you know, pedagogy and how people learn. I think we are in this moment where, at least in the States, standardized testing is kind of hit a threshold where people are, you know, kind of fed up with this idea that we're just training for these tests. Mm-hmm. A much bigger picture. So, you know, if you look at some of the progressive movements going on, Maker Ed or design thinking incorporated with education, or project-based learning, and all the spin-offs in between of these, it's very much about this kind of constructivist, you know, kids creating environments. Mm-hmm. Look at what kids do in Minecraft, for example. It's pretty mind-blowing, you know, like they'll go into this virtual world and without any adult prompts will completely create their own narratives around things.
Yeah, maybe when I said structure, I was confusing the issue, because, you know, I think in terms of the structure of people learning tests, that's obviously ridiculous and completely against the point of the whole thing. But in terms of, you know, Minecraft has a very clear structure, you know, like it has its kind of limitations and it has its space. And it's kind of because of those limitations that space is able to emerge. You know, if you didn't have that certain amount of blocks, if there was different ways of doing everything, then you wouldn't be able to have that level of creativity. But, you know, it's trying to create a space in which the kind of the limitations are understood and also the possibilities.
Kind of like treating the space as almost like an interface of where you have a platform, but then you could have different applications for the space. This is something.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah.
Going back to another idea that comes up in several of your clips, especially in one called information environments. I kind of see you bouncing back between these two worlds of dystopia and utopia. I go back to that same theme again. Clive Thompson, who writes for Wired magazine and publishes books as well, he imagines that we're becoming centaurs. You know, if you look at chess, for example, you know, first it was all about like, oh my God, the computers beat the humans at chess, and now they beat the humans at Go. But the master player is actually a human paired with a computer. That humans paired with computers can beat both humans and other computers. That we're moving at this time that we will have, as you've displayed in several of your clips, this idea that our cognition is very related to the tools that we're using around us. Mm-hmm. How dystopic, you know, in dystopia views, how bad do you see this getting? Like, if you were just to create the horror clip, what would it look like for you?
Well, in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of humans and computers working together, I don't see that as a dystopian vision at all. I think that's for quite a long time. You know, it kind of relates back into this idea of a cyborg theory, where, you know, rather than thinking of cyborgs as people with like artificial eyes or something like that, you can think of, you know, any tool you use, like, you know, your mobile phone or whatever. They're kind of extending your capabilities, and this goes back to, you know, the time when people first using rocks to hit stuff. Is like, that's kind of augmenting your fist to be harder. And so we're just on this kind of post-human evolution now, where we're using tools to be able to augment our abilities to be able to do things that we wouldn't be able to do before. So I think in that way, like, talking about what you're talking about is a very simple evolution from that, and it's not particularly scary. It's almost kind of, it's actually, for me, that's quite exciting, the ability to be able to start to kind of harness the power of computing and apply that to my life in a more direct way. So yeah, I think, you know, the main things I'm worried about, when the main kind of dystopian themes that I think are coming across in the film, it's more like what happens when that power gets exploited, what happens when it's no longer the elite using it, but it starts being sold as kind of a mass market product. You know, how are people going to try and make money from this? How are they going to, you know, when you're wearing like an AR or a mixed reality interface, you're basically opening up your entire world to media. Like every communication becomes something that can be, you know, watched and recorded or bought and sold. And so basically everything, you know, space, air itself becomes a very different thing. You know, it becomes this kind of commodity. So I think, you know, most of the kind of dystopic kind of themes come from that kind of area. And there's actually areas in the film which I don't consider to be dystopian at all. I think they're quite interesting and exciting. Like there's a bit in the early stage of the film where the character walks out onto the road, but the road is kind of a park to begin with, and then when the lights change, then, you know, the use of that space changes as well. And I'm really interested that you could start to have like impromptu like concerts or festivals in, you know, public spaces that are usually designated as, you know, highways or something, but, you know, you can do different things with spaces at different times. I think there's lots of positive ideas in the film as well, but people tend to pick up on the negative ones.
Another one of your clips was called Dandy. And when I look at these clips, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the science fiction writer Octavia Butler, but in an interview, she describes her method of looking at kind of these pieces of culture around her and then blowing them up into their potential, you know, dystopias. You also make me reference Rory Sutherland. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he talks about how the next revolution will be psychological rather than technological. Using Dandy as kind of an example, what was your, you know, I keep kind of going, like, what was your process or catalyst for creating these? Like, what did you see in your environment that could possibly, you know, grow into this?
Oh, well, I think the Dandy is probably one of the easier ones to answer from that. But, you know, I think if you notice people on Instagram or fashion bloggers or kind of YouTube stars who basically they're, you know, within all social media, people who are posting are kind of selling themselves to some extent as a piece of content. Like they're opening up a part of their lives. And the more you see that happen, like people, you know, when people are like posting their breakfasts or something on Twitter, you know, that kind of became like a joke that people were doing that. But really what's happening there is that people are kind of turning their own personalities, their own lives into content, into media. And in some cases, they're able to get paid from that as well. So if you look at the kind of highest earning kind of Instagram and fashion bloggers, they're earning quite a lot of, like, quite a decent living, and more brands and other kind of companies are getting wise to that, and they're using those more. We actually had our launch for Hyperreality in the Bulgari Hotel in London, because I have a kind of a patron from Bulgari who is an admirer of my work and likes to help me out, and their press department organized for some, you know, VIP press people to come to the online the physical theatrical release premiere, and there wasn't a single person from print media anymore. It was all Instagram, you know, people with lots of followers. Everything's related now, not to their kind of the prestige of their publication, but to, you know, how many followers they get. And it makes total sense. So I think the Dandy is just like an evolution of that she is able to sort of make a living just by existing and sharing her experience.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your project, the present that you presented at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I guess I read somewhere that he had like a bunch of different, like it displayed different types of data, different information about the city of London. I was wondering if you could walk us through that process and what you intended with that.
Yeah, sure. So that was, you know, my first big kind of public commission, and it was the flagship piece at the London Design Festival in 2012, and we were able to get access to this amazing space within the V&A museum that had never been open to the public before. If you haven't been to the V&A museum before, it's this incredible museum of craft and yeah, I think from all over the world, and they have this most amazing kind of collection of textiles and stuff. I don't know. It's amazing. You have to go to really understand it. But I wanted to do something, because it was London Design Festival, I wanted to do something, you know, with a kind of scale and directness that, you know, I didn't want you to have to be like an expert in anything to be able to go there and enjoy it. So I decided to make it about the city of London, but not about the city like that you might think about it, about the, you know, the roads and the buildings and the glass and concrete, but it's more about the sort of virtual city that you don't see. Those kind of intangible processes that are happening on a day-to-day basis, you know, kind of credit card transactions and people like using, you know, IC cards to get onto the public transportation, and buildings regulating their heat and energy, and all these different processes that are happening all around us. So we tapped into, I think it was around 55 in the end, and kind of made a big sculpture that sort of visualized all of that information in a sort of patchwork iceberg lantern type thing. So yeah, I think, you know, that ties into the rest of my project, because I'm really interested about this kind of where physical and virtual are coming together, and what kind of tensions emerge in that space.
Yeah, and coming from an architectural standpoint, you mentioned that these are just simply the new tools, the same way that rocks became, you know, extensions of ourselves, that we could become better hunters. Where buildings were, you know, are and work, you know, the way that we constructed these augmented realities around us, or maybe even the way that photography and film have always done, by, you know, looking into this box. Sorry, I lost myself. In this new democratization, do you see it's like revisiting former times where, like, you know, prehistorical times, where body painting and cave painting were our ways of manipulating our environments? You know, we look around Bogota and we see that much of the city has been resurfaced by graffiti artists, you know, on very deep political themes that couldn't necessarily be published in the media. But then you look at the commercial world of who's jumping on augmented reality first, and, you know, I'm thinking of like just a couple of examples I've seen this week. IKEA has an app. You can redesign your apartment by looking at how the furniture would look in your apartment. Or Pokemon Go. I don't know if you know these augmented reality games like Ingress, where you run around the city and the city becomes a different kind of universe. Or the MSQRD app, where you take videos of yourself, but you become an avatar. Where do you see this? You know, it's kind of, we've asked this before, but where do you see it happening as like a democratized form, as opposed to being a commercial, more kind of manipulative form?
Yeah, I suppose I was talking about democratizing effects on the creation of space itself. So if you look at, you know, how we've how kind of the world of photography was completely changed by the introduction of the smartphone camera, and then later now video production as well has become much easier and much cheaper for people to do by themselves. So now we don't need to have, like, well, I suppose I am a kind of filmmaker, but we don't need to have filmmakers anymore. You know, everybody can make films, so it's not about access to tools, even like that much education as well. Lots of those, you know, the learning facilities are available online as well. It's just about kind of interest and discipline, I suppose. And I was talking about that in terms of how we may get to that point in augmented reality as well, where people are able to create their own spaces, and they'll be able to design them, you know, kind of construct them and share them without needing to have any kind of specialist permission or access or anything like that. I think it's really interesting you mentioned graffiti. I think, you know, for me, graffiti and street art is probably the best example of how that's happening today. You know, at the moment, our cities are kind of very much defined by, you know, developers and council, like, you know, governments, and I think it's very little to do with the people who actually live there. You know, people are kind of moved around quite a lot. It depends where you are, I suppose. Maybe in different countries, people feel like a greater sense of ownership and pride over where they live. But I think in big parts of London, at least, it's people don't really feel like they have any stake or investment in where they're from. And graffiti is a way of claiming ownership, of saying like, this is me, this is where I live, this is my patch. And in a way, you could see it as a very positive thing, that people wanting to kind of, you know, have an impact on their city. But you know, so when we expand that and talk about augmented architecture, yeah, I think that's definitely a way of people being able to say like, being able to kind of create a world for themselves and their friends to live in. Of course, it doesn't have the kind of political angle that graffiti does, because you can just turn it off, and so it's kind of, augmented graffiti is completely pointless. But so I think, you know, it's going to be a while before any of that kind of stuff happens. As you say, a lot of the early stage use of AR is going to be around specific applications, and it's going to take us quite a long time to get to kind of a general purpose augmented reality or mixed reality state where like everybody is kind of in that world, and you have like applications talking to each other. But you know, I was trying to think sort of beyond the kind of obvious use cases, and I started to get into this world of customization of urban spaces.
Well, you referenced Chinatowns, about how Chinatowns have moved into cities and reappropriated the city. And I think that's another big theme too, is the appropriation of the space for your own use. You know, as we go around and just kind of observe in Bogota, the appropriation of the city for non-intended uses is absolutely phenomenal. You know, right up the hill from where we're sitting right now, there's downhill longboarders that on Saturdays come screaming down like some crazy stuff. You know, skaters have traditionally just kind of taken over and made the city into a playground space. Sure. And as you said, like the Chinese have moved around the world and they have literally redesigned wherever they go for the space. So when you look at the augmented reality, you know, potentials for this, everyone could have their own design city, you know, as you walk around, and then those could be shared between people. Much, I guess the closest thing we have to relate it to in the classrooms is an app called Aurasma, where Aurasma lets you have trigger images. A trigger image, it could be anything, a picture in text, it could be something on the wall, and then you walk around with your iPad and these images trigger and become other things, video clips or pictures.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, and when I was talking about, you know, Chinese coming in and changing use of space or whatever like that, I was more interested in how that there's, you know, often in European cities, you have architecture that's been there for a very long time, and then onto the front of that is kind of bolted another layer of semiotic kind of understanding. So it's kind of, it could be the sort of short tiled roof, or it could be lanterns, or it could be like any one of a number of kind of symbols which get added onto it, which somehow transform the space and make it and kind of domesticate it, make it like give them a sense of ownership over that space as well. And I thought that was a really interesting precedent to talking about how we could be doing the same kind of thing. And as you say, like creating your own worlds or your own versions of cities. I was particularly interested that people might start to customize the area where they live in, like their local area. So rather than going across the other side of town and doing something, you'd be creating something in your own area and working potentially in collaboration with people who live near to you to create kind of these like localized booms of self-expression. So it could be really interesting in the future to walk through cities and browse through their different layers. And in my second film, Augmented City 3D, there's a scene where the guy is kind of using a kind of a channel browser, I call it, but it's a way of selecting the different layers you want to see with the kind of assumption that there's so much stuff there that you wouldn't possibly be able to see it at once.
Oh, yeah, I think the other one that you did in Medellin was the one that you could have premium features where you don't see the ads, just like we do on internet or like Spotify or stuff. If you don't pay, you know, the premium version, then you're exposed to ads all the time.
Yeah.
But then on the other side, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I noticed like a similar phenomenon in Medellin and that you were mentioning in Bogota about people reappropriating spaces, using them in different ways. And that's actually one of the things that really drew me to Medellin as a city to shoot in, because I think one of the very important things is the climate, is because it's so temperate and the weather is so good all the year round that people don't need to make like very heavy structure everywhere. And you can have areas where you just have seating and tables spilling out. Like, you know, a restaurant can just be like an oven and seats, you know. Very informal, lack of boundaries.
Yeah, no, I think we see that in Colombia and probably all over the world, but I definitely see it a lot here where, if you walk outside my apartment and go a block, you see reappropriation of spaces in just endless forms. Markets appear on the streets, or as we say, like traffic itself becomes opportunity for, window cleaners or beggars or whoever else, or Argentine jugglers or, but like the city seems to be in constant reappropriation of itself, extending that into kind of a digital potential. That's just one kind of mind blowing, but it's mesmerizing to think of like how the city could become, a much more livable, tolerable space. Moving around Bogota can be a pretty gritty experience. The traffic is really heavy. You see, subways in the States or in Europe, people create their own bubbles, their own environments immediately. And I think the more people are able to do that, it would actually maybe be better for, urban environments, especially some of the more difficult, grittier urban environments.
Yeah, you always have to be a little bit careful about kind of solutionism in technology that, we could say that we could improve things, but then maybe that just becomes an enabling technology for us to all cram in even more, whereas maybe we should be talking about, other issues about why these places are unpleasant to walk through in the first place and try to address those. But, there's different ways of approaching it, I guess.
Yeah, when we're looking at your video that you shot in Medellin, you mentioned that you really wanted to address the issue of the space itself becoming like this form of media and yeah, like we've said, like this whole new form of a cultural expression, if you want it. And you say that is completely the opposite of, this homogenized, process. And I can see the same thing happening at schools. Like there's this whole homogenization where we want the students to learn a certain type of content or, do well at this specific type of test and, reach these specific benchmarks. But if we turn it around, then it's something completely different. I want to go back for a little bit to that possibility that this gives us, the digital media gives us, to customize our own house or apartments or even schools. We had a project this year where kids follow like this design thinking mindset, and they started questioning teachers and other students about the way they use their classrooms and what should be fixed and what could be different. And then they went and migrated, took those ideas into Minecraft and built a Minecraft model of what their dream classroom might be.
Very nice.
Here's where you can see like this, really then they are taking ownership of their spaces, and there is not being dictated by the teacher or the school or administrators of what the classroom should look like. Like it's not just rows because you have to do these tests, but the kids are taking ownership and they're thinking about the endless possibilities that the spaces could have.
I think that's really interesting, and also moving that on from, I know we started with an architectural discussion, but of course that relates heavily into customization of curriculum and I guess a lot of that can be enabled by this kind of dark side of AR that people don't talk about so much, which is that in augmented reality or everything is under like total surveillance. You have everything recorded, everything, every move it can be fed into an algorithm somewhere. And in adult very thought, because, whoever's getting that surveillance is then, has kind of this total power. But in a more controlled system, like within a school, for example, that can be used to be able to understand what kids are interested in, what they're spending more time on a very individual level. And trying to help them to modify the curriculum to fit.
Yeah, you also said in that talk in Italy back in 2013 or 2014 that from one of your videos you were trying to throw this question at people, was like, okay, think about this. Because you also mentioned in one of your interviews that this is not a matter of if it will happen, but when will it happen? And you want people to start thinking about, okay, when we get to that level, digital media everywhere, companies and brands and products using these augmented reality technologies to, bomb you with advertising and stuff. If we get there, when we get there, will people have, evolve to adapt to the media, or will that interface and all that media, will it be fit to the person? You know what I'm saying?
This is something that came up in one of your clips. I'm trying to think the name of it. The woman is in transport, and she's wondering if she has adapted to the new tool,
to the interface,
or has the interface adapted more to her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of a philosophical question. A lot of people smarter than I have been talking about for a long time. I suppose, as with the film, in the film, I tried. I don't think what I think about these issues is very important. I think the issues are important. So I guess the film aims to try and sort of highlight those things. Again, in terms of which one it is, it's probably a bit of both. But I think, generally the tools are designed by kind of an elite who live in, the west coast of the US mostly. And the tools are designed around their way of living, their way of thinking. So, to use those tools in other parts of the world, it's probably not a tool that's been directly designed for you, only for the similarities you have with that elite. So I think, that's potentially an issue there. It's a digital divide issue as well.
Well, I think you framed a really big topic in the ed tech world and education, is this idea of personal versus personalized learning. We talked to a guy, Stephen Downs, a couple of months ago, and he talked about basically the same thing you're saying, is that like technology can create these environments where, and this is one side of ed tech that is very strong on this. It's all about having the device study you and, tell you what kind of learner you are and offer you, the next steps, everything from, eye monitoring to facial gesture to movements, to kind of measure if you're on task, if you're understanding, which I find kind of scary. Like the part that really gets me more enthusiastic is what you mentioned earlier about this idea to kind of collaboratively design an augmented reality space. That in a classroom would be just kind of dreamy. We talked a lot about making thinking visible and making learning visible and focusing on process as opposed to final learning products, which usually means just grades. But to actually have kids, kind of looking at what each other is doing in a visual form, and to be able to construct that together. That's very, very exciting. It fits into what Henry Jenkins talked about in his new literacies, about this kind of collective intelligence, about being able to use the dispersed knowledge in your environment and to build together to create these things.
Yeah, great. How important do you think it is to have a kind of physical proximity to be able to achieve those kind of things? Would you see it possible for classrooms in different parts of the world to collaborate with each other, or for there to be people beaming into the classrooms, or for there to be no classrooms at all?
I think there's different factors there. One would be, I think the strongest use is to go back and forth between the synchronous time in class and the asynchronous time when you step away from class. You're broadening the scope of the kind of input that kids will give. And especially if you can get into kind of more multimodality as well. Whereas a kid that goes home, what they'll produce by themselves in their bedroom will often be completely different to what they're contributing in class before the eyes of everyone. But it still has that authentic audience because they know that it's going to be viewed by others, or maybe even be viewed in that moment by others. But it does widen the scope. The global
I was probably trying to get more at the idea of using telepresence for people to be able to be virtually present in a space, and kind of what's the kind of, at the moment, the way we group classes together is, I may be wrong, but it's probably mostly to do with efficiency of communication from teacher to student and vice versa. But of course, we're now living in an age where increasingly it's possible to have a much larger bandwidth, and for that bandwidth, students are physically located. So at the moment, we're doing this podcast, and it's being distributed much wider, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it opens up incredible potentials for your knowledge base. Like now, everything is sort of the adjacent possible. If kids need to talk to a doctor, then we get them talking to a doctor. If we don't have the kind of knowledge they're going after, they can create that interview. And then what we do with that interview, the online event becomes something that we prepare for and then something that we study afterwards, much like we do with our podcast here. Whereas, we'll spend a couple of weeks studying somebody, finding out what they can contribute to the world of education. And then we also study afterwards by blogging or discussions, whatever else. I think there's always going to be the advantage of, I guess, what the business world calls synergy, but there's a different mirror neuron reflex that humans have in face-to-face interaction as opposed to screen-to-screen interaction. So I think babies that have been studied will learn the sounds of a language more quickly if it's a live person talking to them than if they're in front of a screen. And I think there are big differences there. But at the same time, the capabilities of what your authentic audience now, it can be the world. It's more about creating those networks and being able to take advantage of those networks.
I suppose that, the kind of tech we're talking about though is a long way removed from sitting in front of a screen. We're talking about being able to be in collaborative and participatory virtual environments now. So you could have kids who go to, let's say they do go to kind of a designated building, like a school, but in the morning they put their headset on and they're, across the other side of the world in a lecture about something they're really interested in, or they're working on a sort of purely virtual space that maybe, set in like a multicolored world, and they're collaborating on projects with different students, but then the bell rings and they take their helmet off and they go and wrestle or something, so there's like, each kid could have a very different curriculum and a very different program, but the whole thing could be arranged to sort of suit that. Would that be something that would be
that's the goal, is to create these learning groups and communities where to get away. I think the school efficiency thing is going to be hard. There is a reason, I guess, we all go to school and all go into a classroom and mix with other kids. Like, there is a power to the learning community, but there's nothing to say that your learning community couldn't be dispersed around the world. We talked to Matt Richards in New Zealand, and his students will design with other kids, maybe in a Minecraft world all week, and then at the end of the week they'll have the conference critique, or they'll have FaceTime with these kids all over the world. So they have their classroom community, but there's nothing to say that can't be connected and joined all over the place.
I suppose with all of this stuff, and with my friends as well, and when we're talking about this kind of level of technology, you're talking about a world which is, to our kind of primitive minds in 2016. And it's just about now trying to understand where it's the best place to put those limits in order to allow us to progress.
Well, I think what needs to happen is you need to get a Kickstarter program started to create a series of education versions of hyperreality. Because I think a lot of the things that we're talking about are already happening in pockets around the world. But the potentials of what they could become are just amazing.
But then again, it reminded me of a concept that you mentioned in a different interview where you said, if we're talking about spaces and redesigning spaces and redefining the use of a space, architects then should become what you said, or you call experience designers. So for us, that would mean that teachers would need to really think about how to map these units and how to create where this Skype call can happen in the middle of my curriculum or my study unit, or designing those learning experiences in the classroom and how the use of these new technologies can enhance those.
Sure. You were talking about how the ubiquity of camera and film development, now everybody can be a creator. And I think what that's slowly causing, and you can see it in a lot of the teacher literature, is that teachers are starting to become designers of learning experiences. That idea of, like, you're not just going to be lecturing, even though the lecture I think is still an important element. You're basically trying to redesign or create this learning experience, and the digital world definitely comes into play there. I think what happens a lot of the times is that things come so prepackaged. I mean, no offense, but like usually an architecture project in a school, is 90% of the time an ego project. You know, it's an architect who came in, and this is like how they idealize people utilizing this space, as opposed to creating, I guess, what the D School at Stanford has created, or what Dan O'Sullivan at the ITP School in New York calls that reprogrammable architecture, where you have a space that has an interface, but that can be reprogrammed for whatever kind of application you need it for. If you need today to be a group presentation or a museum or small group work, you could quickly maneuver the space to become that. And
well, the idea of doing that reprogrammable space dates from the 60s, if not before. An architect called Cedric Price did a project called the Fun Palace, which is kind of the first example of this sort of reprogrammable architecture. It had all these different elements you could move around to create different types of spaces. And then Archigram in the UK as well, you know, kind of followed up a lot of that, thinking about, you know, different types of architecture which can be repurposed, and it's kind of built for that, built to be the repurposed or disposable in itself. But I think what you're saying about teachers becoming experience designers is a very interesting thing. And we're getting to a stage now where the level of complexity involved in creating those experiences becomes more than, you know, one or a handful of people can really viably handle. Similar to, you know, in the past, if you go and into your classroom and, you know, when I was at school, sometimes the teacher would put on like a VHS tape and we'd sit and watch that for a while. You know, we have a choice now of either going to that same kind of world where you have this, you know, this VR session or whatever, and you put on your goggles for a bit, and it's basically you get played an experience. Or if we can try to get teachers working more closely with, you know, software developers or like spatial designers or all these different experiences which are trying to integrate more, and, you know, are therefore, you know, more powerful. It's not just sitting there and watching something. It's actually transforming the whole process of education.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, like we said before, you've touched on a couple of different very important ideas in the education worlds. For example, you said before that it's not about the hardware or, you know, the technology tool itself, but what that allows you to do. And really what teachers, when designing these type of experiences, should be thinking of is, okay, what, you know, thinking skills or what abilities am I, you know, allowing my students with the use of these tools. Is not just sitting there watching a movie in 360, which, you know, they can already do that with the Google Expeditions. They can just put on their sets and go on a virtual field trip anywhere in the world. But really is, what are you designing around that?
That's good, actually. It's interesting. I'd love to do it. I think the idea of doing this kind of utopian project for education makes a lot of sense, you know, because I think it's because it's not the whole world. It's a more contained environment. It's much more easy to imagine how that can be made in a more utopian way.
Well, and you know, like we've seen a lot of tech tools in the last, you know, 5 to 8 years come into play, mobile devices especially. And there's been, not just at our school, but all over the place, a lot of frustration with getting the teacher adoption and the integration of these devices into their pedagogy. Mm-hmm. So one of our spin-off projects from this project, or the podcast project, is what we call hacking active learning spaces. And it's to use the physical space of your classroom design. You know, every teacher is very attached to how they design their classroom. Like if you really want to piss a teacher off, just walk in their room and rearrange things, you know, move things around their desk. And, you know, this is sort of that, I go back to this term, kind of the adjacent possible of, you know, if we could detach the metaphors of our classroom interactions, you know, we call them from Thornburg, like the cave of encapsulating your own thoughts, to the watering hole where you interact in small group, to the campfire where you all come together for presentation, and then something called the mountaintop, where, like, how does the transference of learning go into the real world? If we work from those and then attach to our physical spaces our digital tools. Okay, so if you need more encapsulation, how could this iPad and the apps on it create an even deeper metacognition, an even deeper reflective experience? And this is what really drew me when I, you know, as soon as I saw your video Hyperreality, I was like, that's what we're talking about. Like, you know, the ability to kind of create these spaces and, you know, using our own, what we know about psychology and human interaction, creating metaphors for those, and then extending that into our digital environments. You know, maybe that would make more sense to people who are not techie. It's like, oh, I believe in, student encapsulation and metacognition and students having some processing time. Now, how could our tech tools take that to a whole new level? Does that make sense?
So I think, there's two potential outcomes. Maybe this is the dystopia and the utopia we're talking about. On one side, you have a very top-down approach where you have some curriculum as well as all of the content within curriculum, and the teachers are essentially staffed to be able to kind of deliver this experience. They're kind of support workers, which I'm imagining you would see that as
I don't think you're describing dystopia. I think you're describing the current learning environment.
Yeah. On the other side, you have the technology integrated in such a way that teachers are able to use them as tools to build their own curriculum or whatever, and use them to kind of extend their reach to make them more effective at what they do already. And that's obviously it sounds better not just for teaching and education, but for human beings in general. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could use technology to extend our capabilities rather than to make us act in certain ways? But to do that is to imagine the steps that would take from where we are now to get to a kind of hyper-reality education utopia. It's quite a lot. There's a lot of steps to go through there, and it's not just the education system that's being slow or whatever. It sounds like you guys are actually doing some really amazing work compared to lots of other sectors. It's just the time it takes to absorb these technologies in general. And I don't worry about it too much, because although I like to see kind of advancement, I like to see progress, I also like, if things change very quickly, then we don't really get time to process if that change has been a positive thing before the next change comes along. So we have less control over it, Whereas this way, you can trial it for a bit, you can take it out, put it in, do A/B testing.
Well, I mean, I think a big part of the problem is that the tech tools advance really quickly. And, if you look at like tech adoption just by the public, it's really quick. Like Pokemon Go came out a few days ago, and it's like about to overcome Twitter and its user base, whatever. That's not really the problem. Like two parts. One is that those are like structural pieces you put in a school, but you're talking about the human element, the process variables. And these are very difficult to change, and they could be generational in change. And yet our tools are offering all of these other potentials of what school could be, or what the learning environment could look like. But if the teachers aren't willing to do that, or don't know how to do that, something as simple as the photograph. If you look at the development of photography, the technology was there, but it took 100 years for people to kind of accept it as that the eye of the photographer was important, that this could be an art form, that Alfred Stieglitz and his followers, their viewpoints were important, as opposed to it just being like a simple documentation of, what's there in the world. Now, if you go around the world and look at who's taking pictures and how they're using them, how they're thinking about them, it's probably not going that deep. Like the media literacy around photography is probably not, we haven't realized the potential of this medium. So it makes sense that like, just because we throw some iPads into a classroom, well, yeah, and if nobody knows what to do with those things, then it's not going to, mean much. Or if we have this capability to create these augmented reality environments, but that might scare the bejesus out of people, or they might totally.
But we just need to make it easy and useful for teachers, right? Because they've got a lot to do already. They get anything like it is in the UK. They get paid nothing. That hours are stupid, and it's like a high pressure job, but it's also a really important job. So it attracts those individuals who are willing to take that punishment. So like giving them a load of new technology and trying to get them to learn new things is probably not what they want to be doing. They'd probably be at the bar or something, right? So I think it's about trying to make it easy and make it something that's going to improve the quality of the lesson they're trying to give, and make it easier for them as well. So I guess that those should be the kind of the short-term goals.
Thinking through like what your work would look like in the education environment, like we have tons of suggestions. If you ever would like to create that, like I think that would be just phenomenal.
Yeah.
What are your next plans for the hyperreality project? I mean, are you going to make more of these video clips? Do you come up with more of these ideas? Are you going to write a book? Like what are you planning to do with all of this?
So I made 2 films, one called Augmented Hyperreality Domestic Robocop and the other one called Augmented City 3D. I made those 6 years ago during my master's. And I had this idea to kind of extend and reimagine that series, which resulted in Hyperreality, the film I released recently and the one that you saw. But Hyperreality is imagined as part of a new series, a new trilogy. So I'm planning to do 2 more films set in the same city in Medellin on the same day, but from the perspective of different characters. So you're going to see a very, very different picture of the city viewed from the subjectivity of somebody else. So I'm at the moment looking for funding for these films. We've got some interested sponsors already, but I'm trying to make it this kind of advanced form of product placement. So instead of just sponsoring us and we'll put your logo in the film, I actually want to work with the brands or institutions who are sponsoring to try and develop and understand how their product or service or whatever they're supplying would be, how that would look in the future. So it's kind of more of a collaborative process. So I'm the next film is I'm focusing a lot more on, which I don't know if I should say, but it's more of a social thing. I'm talking more about like social experiences more. The third film is reasonably wide open. I've got some good ideas for it, but I would really love to do some like education stuff. So if anybody out there is listening and they think that their institution could, play a part in that future and would like to give us some money to make it, then I'm very happy to receive it.
I'm not sure how that needs to be written up, but I think it would be a fascinating project. You mentioned that in Medellin, I forget where I read this, but that in the final day of filming, you described the city that's trying to escape its past by embracing a brighter future. And this kind of fits into this idea of an augmented reality, that your camera was stolen by a gunman who came by on a motorcycle. Do you plan on including these types of themes? Colombia's a fascinating environment for this country with incredible momentum, especially in the urban centers, but also with a very dark past in some pockets.
Yeah, I've been kind of torn about it, to be honest, because people's perception from the outside world, a lot of the time when people think of Colombia, they're thinking of violence and drugs and all these terrible things that have happened to the country in the past. But then when you go and visit the country, it's so wonderful, and there's so much other stuff to think about and talk about. Sure, and about I think there's a general positivity in the city that doesn't really get kind of communicated in lots of other kind of. So I kind of, in a way, I want to focus on the good stuff, on the positive things about the city. But my Medellin in the first place, one of the reasons at least, was that, as I was talking about before, a lot of these technologies are designed and built in the kind of by the elite in the west coast of the US or wherever else. And I'm interested in how these technologies progress. So once they've been used and the elite have moved on to something else, what's going to happen to the rest of us? And I thought it would be interesting to set the film in kind of an emerging economy, to be able to look at the kind of unintended effects of those things.
Cool. Well, come visit us in Bogota when you come back to do filming here.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you.
Thanks for taking the time. I would love to follow up, and if you do anything with education, I'd be fascinated to follow that as well.
Great. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.